Hello, and welcome to Fireside Audiobooks. If you're looking to escape the world for a little while, you have come to the right place. Today, we're reading a true classic, The Scottish Fairy Book by Elizabeth W. Grierson. It's a collection that really captures the heart of folklore. It's whimsical, a little bit eerie, and totally captivating. If you enjoy these readings, please do hit the subscribe button to keep our fires burning. Now, get comfortable and get yourself a nice hot drink, and let's begin. The Scottish Fairy Book by Elizabeth W. Grierson, with illustrations by Maurice Meredith Williams. Narrated by Liz S. There are, roughly speaking, two distinct types of Scottish fairy tales. There are what may be called Celtic stories, which were handed down for centuries by word of mouth by professional storytellers who went about from clan to clan in the Highlands and Islands, earning a night's shelter by giving a night's entertainment, and which have now been collected and classified for us by Campbell of Islay and others. These stories, which are also common to the north of Ireland, are wild and fantastic, and very often somewhat monotonous, and their themes are strangely alike. They almost always tell of some hero or heroine who sets out on some dangerous quest, and who is met by giants, generally 3 in number, who appear one after the other, with whom they hold quaint dialogues and whom eventually they slay. Most of them are fairly long, and although they have a peculiar fascination of their own, they are quite distinct from the ordinary fairy tale. These latter, in Scotland, have also a character of their own, for there is no country where the existence of spirits and goblins has been so implicitly believed in up to a comparatively recent date. As a proof of this, we can go to Hog's Tale of the Wool Gatherer and see how the countryman Barnaby voices the belief of his day. Ye had need to take care how ye dispute the existence of fairies, brownies, and apparitions. Ye may as well dispute the Gospel of St. Matthew. Perhaps it was the bleak and stern character of their climate and the austerity of their religious beliefs which made our Scottish forefathers think of the spirits in whom they so firmly as being for the most part mischievous and malevolent. Their bogies, their witches, their kelpies, even their fairy queen herself was supposed to be in league with the evil one, and to be compelled, as Thomas of Ercildoune was near finding out to his cost, to pay a teen to hell every 7 years. So it was not to be wondered at that these uncanny beings were dreaded and feared. But along with this dark and gloomy view, we find touches of delicate playfulness and brightness. The fairy queen might be in league with Satan, but her subjects were not all bound by the same law, and many charming tales are told of the Sith or silent folk, who are always spoken of with respect, in case they might be within earshot, who made their dwellings under some rocky knoll, and who came out and danced on the dewy sward at midnight. Akin to them are the tales which are told about a mysterious region under the sea, far below the abode of fishes, where a strange race of beings lived, who, in their own land, closely resembled human beings, and were of such surpassing beauty that they charmed the hearts of all who looked on them. They were spoken of as mermaids and mermen, and as their lungs were not adapted for breathing under water, they had the extraordinary power of entering into the skin of some fish or sea animal, and in this way passing from their own abode to our upper world, where they held converse with mortal men. and, as often as not, tried to lure them to destruction. The popular idea always represents merfolk as wearing the tails of fishes. In Scottish folklore, they are quite as often found in the form of seals. Then we frequently come across the brownie, that strange, kindly, lovable creature with its shaggy, unkempt appearance, half man, half beast, who was said to be the ordained helper of man in the drudgery entailed by sin, and was therefore forbidden to receive wages, who always worked when no one was looking, and who disappeared if any notice were taken of him. There are also, as in all other countries, animal tales where the animals are endowed with the power of speech, and weird tales of enchantment, and last but not least, there are the legendary stories, many of them half real, half mythical, which are to be found in the pages of Hogg and Leyden, and above all in Sir Walter Scott's Border Minstrelsy. In preparing this book, I have tried to make a representative collection from these different classes of Scottish folklore, taking, when possible, the stories which are least well known, in the hope that some of them, at least, may be new to the children of this generation. It may interest some of these children to know that when James IV was a little boy, nearly 400 years ago, he used to sit on his tutor, Sir David Lindsay's knee, and listen to some of the same stories that are written here. To the story of Thomas the Rhymer, of the Red Étin, and of the Black Bull of Norroway. Although in every case I have told the tale in my own words, I am indebted for the originals to Campbell's Popular Tales of the Western Highlands, Leyden's Poems, Hogg's Poems, Scott's Border Minstrelsy, Chambers' Popular Rhymes of Scotland, the Folklore Journal, etc. Elizabeth W. Grierson, Winchester's Holwick, N.B., 12th of April, 1910. Thomas the Rhymer. Of all the young gallants in Scotland in the 13th century, there was none more gracious and debonair than Thomas Learmont, laird of the castle of Ercildoune in Berwickshire. He loved books, poetry, and music, which were uncommon tastes in those days, and above all, he loved to study nature, and to watch the habits of the beasts and birds that made their abode in the fields and woods round about his home. Now, it chanced that one sunny May morning Thomas left his tower of Ercildoune and went wandering into the woods that lay about the Huntly Burn, a little stream that came rushing down from the slopes of the Eildon Hills. It was a lovely morning, fresh and bright and warm, and everything was so beautiful that it looked as paradise might look. The tender leaves were bursting out of their sheaths and covering all the trees with a fresh, soft mantle of green. And amongst the carpet of moss under the young man's feet, yellow primroses and starry anemones were turning up their faces to the morning sky. The little birds were singing like to burst their throats, and hundreds of insects were flying backwards and forwards in the sunshine, while down by the burnside the bright-eyed water rats were poking their noses out of their holes as if they knew that summer had come, and wanted to have a share in all that was going on. Thomas felt so happy with the gladness of it all that he threw himself down at the root of a tree to watch the living things around him. As he was lying there, he heard the trampling of a horse's hoofs as it forced its way through the bushes, and, looking up, he saw the most beautiful lady that he had ever seen, coming riding towards him in a grey palfrey. She wore a hunting dress of glistening silk, the colour of the fresh spring grass, and from her shoulders hung a velvet mantle, which matched the riding skirt exactly. Her yellow hair, like rippling gold, hung loosely round her shoulders, and on her head sparkled a diadem of precious stones, which flashed like fire in the sunlight. Her saddle was of pure ivory, and her saddle cloth of blood-red satin, while her saddle girths were of corded silk, and her stirrups of cut crystal. Her horse's reins were of beaten gold, all hung with little silver bells, so that, as she rode along, she made a sound like fairy music. Apparently she was bent on the chase, for she carried a hunting horn and a sheaf of arrows, and she led 7 greyhounds along in a leash, while as many scenting hounds ran loose at her horse's side. As she rode down the glen, she lilted a bit of an old Scotch song, and she carried herself with such a queenly air, and her dress was so magnificent that Thomas was like to kneel by the side of the path and worship her, for he thought that it must be the Blessed Virgin herself. But when the rider came to where he was and understood his thoughts, she shook her head sadly. "I am not that blessed lady, as thou thinkest," she said. "Men call me queen, but it is of a far other country, for I am the queen of fairyland, and not the queen of heaven." And certainly it seemed as if what she said were true, for from that moment it was as if a spell were cast over Thomas, making him forget prudence and caution and common sense itself, for he knew that it was dangerous for mortals to meddle with fairies, yet he was so entranced with the lady's beauty that he begged her to give him a kiss. This was just what she wanted, for she knew that if she once kissed him, she had him in her power. And, to the young man's horror, as soon as their lips had met, an awful change came over her, for her beautiful mantle and riding skirt of silk seemed to fade away, leaving her clad in a long grey garment, which was just the colour of ashes. Her beauty seemed to fade away also, and she grew old, and worst of all, half of her abundant yellow hair went grey before his very eyes. She saw the poor man's astonishment and terror, and she burst into a mocking laugh. "I am not so fair to look on now as I was at first," she said. "But that matters little, for thou hast sold thyself, Thomas, to be my servant for 7 long years. For whoso kisseth the fairy queen must e'en go with her to fairyland and serve her there till that time is past." When he heard these words, poor Thomas fell on his knees and begged for mercy, but mercy he could not obtain. The elfin queen only laughed in his face and brought her dapple grey palfrey close up to where he was standing. "No, no," she said, in answer to his entreaties. "Thou didn't ask the kiss, and now thou must pay the price. So dally no longer, but mount behind me, for it is full time that I was gone." So Thomas, with many a sigh and groan of terror, mounted behind her, and as soon as he had done so, she shook her bridle rein, and the grey steed galloped off. On and on they went, going swifter than the wind, till they left the land of the living behind and came to the edge of a great desert, which stretched before them, dry and bare and desolate, to the edge of the far horizon. At least, so it seemed to the weary eyes of Thomas of Ercildoune, and he wondered if he and his strange companion had to cross this desert, and if so, if there were any chance of reaching the other side of it alive. But the fairy queen suddenly tightened her rein, and the grey palfrey stopped short in its wild career. "Now must thou descend to earth, Thomas," said the lady, glancing over her shoulder at her unhappy captive, "and lout down and lay the head on my knee, and I will show the hidden things which cannot be seen by mortal eyes." So Thomas dismounted, and louted down, and rested his head on the fairy queen's knee, and lo, as he looked once more over the desert, everything seemed changed, for he saw 3 roads leading across it now, which he had not noticed before, and each of these 3 roads was different. One of them was broad and level and even, and it ran straight on across the sand, so that no one who was travelling by it could possibly lose his way. And the second road was as different from the first as it well could be. It was narrow and winding and long, and there was a thorn hedge on one side of it, and a briar hedge on the other, and those hedges grew so high, and their branches were so wild and tangled, that those who were travelling along that road would have some difficulty in persevering on their journey at all. And the third road was unlike any of the others. It was a bonny road, winding up a hillside among brackens and heather and golden yellow winds, and it looked as if it would be pleasant travelling to pass that way. "Now," said the fairy queen, "an thou wilt, I shall tell thee where these 3 roads lead to. The first road, as thou seest, is broad and even and easy, and there be many that choose it to travel on. But though it be a good road, it leadeth to a bad end, and the folk that choose it repent their choice for ever. And as the narrow road, all hampered and hindered by the thorns and the briars, there be few that be troubled to ask where that leadeth to. But did they ask, perchance more of them might be stirred up to set out along it, for that is the road of righteousness. And although it be hard and irksome, yet it endeth in a glorious city, which is called the city of the great king. And the third road, the bonny road, that runs up the brae among the ferns, and leadeth no mortal kens whither, but I ken where it leadeth, Thomas, for it leadeth unto fair Elfland, and that road take we. And mark ye, Thomas, if ever thou hopest to see thine own tower of Ercildown again, take care of the tongue when we reach our journey's end, and speak no single word to any one save me. For the mortal who openeth his lips rashly in fairyland must bide there for ever." Then she bade him mount her palfrey again, and they rode on. The ferny road was not so bonny all the way as it had been at first, however, for they had not ridden along it very far before it led them into a narrow ravine, which seemed to go right down under the earth, where there was no ray of light to guide them, and where the air was dank and heavy. There was a sound of rushing water everywhere, and at last the grey palfrey plunged right into it, and it crept up, cold and chill, first over Thomas's feet, and then over his knees. His courage had been slowly ebbing ever since he had been parted from the daylight, but now he gave himself up for lost, for it seemed to him certain that his strange companion and he would never come safe to their journey's end. He fell forward in a kind of swoon, and, if it had not been that he had tight hold of the fairy's ash-grey gown, I warrant he had fallen from his seat and had been drowned. But all things, be they good or bad, pass in time, and at last the darkness began to lighten, and the light grew stronger, until they were back in broad sunshine. Then Thomas took courage and looked up, and lo, they were riding through a beautiful orchard, where apples and pears, dates and figs and wineberries grew in great abundance. And his tongue was so parched and dry, and he felt so faint, that he longed for some of the fruit to restore him. He stretched out his hand to pluck some of it, but his companion turned in her saddle and forbade him. "There is nothing safe for thee to eat here," she said, "save an apple, which I will give thee presently. If thou touch aught else, thou art bound to remain in fairyland for ever." So poor Thomas had to restrain himself as best he could, and they rode slowly on until they came to a tiny tree all covered with red apples. The fairy queen bent down and plucked one and handed it to her companion. "This I can give thee," she said, "and I do it gladly, for these apples are the apples of truth, and whoso eateth them gaineth this reward, that his lips will never more be able to frame a lie." Thomas took the apple and ate it, and for evermore the grace of truth rested on his lips, and that is why, in after years, men called him True Thomas. They had only a little way to go after this before they came in sight of a magnificent castle standing on a hillside. "Yonder is my abode," said the queen, pointing to it proudly. "There dwelleth my lord and all the nobles of his court, and as my lord hath an uncertain temper and shows no liking for any strange gallant whom he sees in my company, I pray thee, both for thy sake and mine, to utter no word to any one who speaketh to thee, and if any one should ask me who and what thou art, I will tell them that thou art dumb, so wilt thou pass unnoticed in the crowd." With these words the lady raised her hunting horn and blew a loud and piercing blast, and as she did so, a marvelous change came over her again. For her ugly ash-covered gown dropped off her, and the grey in her hair vanished, and she appeared once more in her green riding skirt and mantle, and her face grew young and fair. And a wonderful change passed over Thomas also, for, as he chanced to glance downwards, he found that his rough country clothes had been transformed into a suit of fine brown cloth, and that on his feet he wore satin shoon. Immediately the sound of the horn rang out, the doors of the castle flew open, and the king hurried out to meet the queen, accompanied by such a number of knights and ladies, minstrels and page boys, that Thomas, who had slid from his palfrey, had no difficulty in obeying her wishes and passing into the castle unobserved. Everyone seemed very glad to see the queen back again, and they crowded into the great hall in her train, and she spoke to them all graciously and allowed them to kiss her hand. Then she passed with her husband to a dais at the far end of the huge apartment, where two thrones stood on which the royal pair seated themselves to watch the revels which now began. Poor Thomas, meanwhile, stood far away at the other end of the hall, feeling very lonely, yet fascinated by the extraordinary scene on which he was gazing. For, although all the fine ladies and courtiers and knights were dancing in one part of the hall, there were huntsmen coming and going in another part, carrying in great antlered deer, which apparently they had killed in the chase, and throwing them down in heaps on the floor. And there were rows of cooks standing beside the dead animals, cutting them up into joints and bearing away the joints to be cooked. Although it was such a strange, fantastic scene that Thomas took no heed of how the time flew, but stood and gazed, never speaking a word to anybody. This went on for 3 long days. Then the queen rose from her throne and, stepping from the dais, crossed the hall to where he was standing. "'Tis time to mount and ride, Thomas," she said, "if thou wouldst ever see the fair castle of Ercildown again." Thomas looked at her in amazement. "Thou spokest of 7 long years, lady," he exclaimed, "and I have been here but 3 days." The queen smiled. "Time passeth quickly in fairyland, my friend," she replied. "Thou thinkest that thou hast been here but 3 days. 'Tis 7 years since we two met, and now it is time for thee to go. I would fain have had thy presence with me longer, but I dare not, for thine own sake. For every 7th year an evil spirit cometh from the regions of darkness and carrieth back with him one of our followers, whomsoever he chanceth to choose. And, as thou art a goodly fellow, I fear that he might choose thee. So as I would be loath to let harm befall thee, I will take thee back to thine own country this very night. Once more the grey palfrey was brought, and Thomas and the Queen mounted it, and as they had come, so they returned to the Eildon tree near the Huntley burn. Then the Queen bade Thomas farewell, and as a parting gift he asked her to give him something that would let people know that he had really been to Fairyland. "I have already given thee the gift of truth," she replied. "I will now give thee the gifts of prophecy and poesy, so that thou wilt be able to foretell the future, and also to write wondrous verses. And besides these unseen gifts, here is something that mortals can see with their own eyes, a harp that was fashioned in Fairyland. Fare thee well, my friend. Some day, perchance, I will return for thee again." With these words the lady vanished, and Thomas was left alone, feeling a little sorry, if the truth be told, at parting with such a radiant being, and coming back to the ordinary haunts of men. After this he lived for many a long year in his castle of Ersildon, and fame of his poetry and of his prophecies spread all over the country, so that people named him True Thomas and Thomas the Rhymer. I cannot write down for you all the prophecies which Thomas uttered, and which most surely came to pass, but I will tell you one or two. He foretold the battle of Bannockburn in these words: "The burn of bride shall rin foul ride," which came to pass on that terrible day when the waters of the little Bannockburn were reddened by the blood of the defeated English. He also foretold the union of the crowns of England and Scotland under a prince who was the son of a French queen, and who yet bore the blood of Bruce in his veins. "A French queen shall bear the sun, shall rule all Britain to the sea, as near as is the 9th degree." Which thing came true in 1603, when King James, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, became monarch of both countries. 14 long years went by, and people were beginning to forget that Thomas the Rhymer had ever been in Fairyland. But at last a day came when Scotland was at war with England, and the Scottish army was resting by the banks of the Tweed, not far from the tower of Ersildon. And the master of the tower determined to make a feast and invite all the nobles and barons who were leading the army to sup with him. That feast was long remembered, for the Laird of Ersildon took care that everything was as magnificent as it could possibly be. And when the meal was ended, he rose in his place, and taking his elfin harp, he sang to his assembled guests song after song of the days of long ago. The guests listened breathlessly, for they felt that they would never hear such a wonderful music again, and so it fell out. For that very night, after all the nobles had gone back to their tents, a soldier on guard saw in the moonlight a snow-white hart and hind move slowly down the road that ran past the camp. There was something so unusual about the animals that he called to his officer to come and look at them, and the officer called to his brother officers, and soon there was quite a crowd softly following the dumb creatures, who paced solemnly on as if they were keeping time to music unheard by mortal ears. "There is something uncanny about this," said one soldier at last. "Let us send for Thomas of Ersildon. Perchance he may be able to tell us if it be an omen or no." "Aye, send for Thomas of Ersildon," cried every one at once. So a little page was sent in haste to the old tower to rouse the Rhymer from his slumbers. When he heard the boy's message, the seer's face grew grave and rapt. "'Tis a summons," he said softly, "a summons from the Queen of Fairyland. I have waited long for it, and it hath come at last." And when he went out, instead of joining the little company of waiting men, he walked straight up to the snow-white hart and hind. As soon as he reached them, they paused for a moment as if to greet him. Then all three moved slowly down a steep bank that sloped to the little river Leda, and disappeared in its foaming waters, for the stream was in full flood. And, although a careful search was made, no trace of Thomas of Ercildown was found. And to this day the country folk believe that the hart and the hind were messengers from the elfin queen, and that he went back to fairyland with them. Gold Tree and Silver Tree. In bygone days there lived a little princess named Gold Tree, and she was one of the prettiest children in the whole world. Although her mother was dead, she had a very happy life, for her father loved her dearly, and thought that nothing was too much trouble so long as it gave his little daughter pleasure. But by and by he married again, and then the little princess's sorrows began. For his new wife, whose name, curious to say, was Silver Tree, was very beautiful, but she was also very jealous, and she made herself quite miserable for fear that some day she should meet someone who was better looking than she was herself. When she found that her stepdaughter was so very pretty, she took a dislike to her at once, and was always looking at her and wondering if people would think her prettier than she was. And because in her heart of hearts she was afraid that they would do so, she was very unkind indeed to the poor girl. At last, one day, when Princess Goldtree was quite grown up, the two ladies went for a walk to a little well which lay all surrounded by trees in the middle of a deep glen. Now the water in this well was so clear that everyone who looked into it saw his face reflected on the surface. And the proud queen loved to come and peep into its depths, so that she could see her own picture mirrored in the water. But today, as she was looking in, what should she see but a little trout, which was swimming quietly backwards and forwards, not very far from the surface. "Trouty, Trouty, answer me this one question," said the queen. "Am not I the most beautiful woman in the world?" "No, indeed you are not," replied the trout promptly, jumping out of the water as he spoke in order to swallow a fly. "Who is the most beautiful woman, then?" asked the disappointed queen, for she had expected a far different answer. "Thy stepdaughter, the Princess Goldtree, without a doubt," said the little fish. Then, frightened by the black look that came upon the jealous queen's face, he dived to the bottom of the well. It was no wonder that he did so, for the queen's expression was not pleasant to look at. As she darted an angry glance at her fair young stepdaughter, who was busy picking flowers some little distance away. Indeed, she was so annoyed at the thought that anyone should say that the girl was prettier than she was, that she quite lost her self-control, and when she reached home she went up in a violent passion to her room and threw herself on the bed, declaring that she felt very ill indeed. It was in vain that Princess Goldtree asked her what the matter was, and if she could do anything for her. She would not let the poor girl touch her, but pushed her away as if she had been some evil thing. So at last the princess had to leave her alone and go out of the apartment, feeling very sad indeed. By and by the king came home from his hunting, and he at once asked for the queen. He was told that she had been seized with sudden illness, and that she was lying on her bed in her own room, and that no one, not even the court physician, who had been hastily summoned, could make out what was wrong with her. In great anxiety, for he really loved her, the king went up to her bedside and asked the queen how she felt, and if there was anything that he could do to relieve her. "Yes, there is one thing that thou couldst do," she answered harshly, "but I know full well that, even although it is the only thing that will cure me, thou wilt not do it." "Nay," said the king, "I deserve better words at thy mouth than these, for thou knowest that I would give thee aught thou carest to ask, even if it be the half of my kingdom." "Then give me the daughter's heart to eat," cried the queen, "for unless I can obtain that, I will die, and that speedily." She spoke so wildly and looked at him in such a strange fashion that the poor king really thought that her brain was turned, and he was at his wits' end what to do. He left the room and paced up and down the corridor in great distress, until at last he remembered that that very morning the son of a great king had arrived from a country far over the sea, asking for his daughter's hand in marriage. "Here is a way out of the difficulty," he said to himself. "This marriage pleaseth me well, and I will have it celebrated at once. Then, when my daughter is safe out of the country, I will send a lad up the hillside, and he shall kill a he-goat, and I will have its heart prepared and dressed, and send it up to my wife. Perhaps the sight of it will cure her of this madness." So he had the strange prince summoned before him, and told him how the queen had taken a sudden illness that had wrought on her brain, and had caused her to take a dislike to the princess, and how it seemed as if it would be a good thing if, with the maiden's consent, the marriage could take place at once, so that the queen might be left alone to recover from her strange malady. Now the prince was delighted to gain his bride so easily, and the princess was glad to escape from her stepmother's hatred, so the marriage took place at once, and the newly wedded pair set off across the sea for the prince's country. Then the king sent a lad up the hillside to kill a he-goat, and when it was killed he gave orders that its heart should be dressed and cooked and sent to the queen's apartment on a silver dish. And the wicked woman tasted it, believing it to be the heart of her stepdaughter, and when she had done so, she rose from her bed and went about the castle looking as well and hearty as ever. I am glad to be able to tell you that the marriage of Princess Goldtree, which had come about in such a hurry, turned out to be a great success. For the prince whom she had wedded was rich and great and powerful, and he loved her dearly, and she was as happy as the day was long. So things went peacefully on for a year. Queen Silvertree was satisfied and contented because she thought that her stepdaughter was dead, while all the time the princess was happy and prosperous in her new home. But at the end of the year it chanced that the queen went once more to the well in the little glen in order to see her face reflected in the water. And it chanced also that the same little trout was swimming backwards and forwards, just as he had done the year before. And the foolish queen determined to have a better answer to her question this time than she had last. "Trouty, Trouty," she whispered, leaning over the edge of the well, "am not I the most beautiful woman in the world?" "By my troth, thou art not," answered the trout in his very straightforward way. "Who is the most beautiful woman, then?" asked the queen, her face growing pale at the thought that she had yet another rival. "Why, your majesty's stepdaughter, the Princess Goldtree, to be sure," answered the trout. The queen threw back her head with a sigh of relief. "Well, at any rate, people cannot admire her now," she said, "for it is a year since she died. I ate her heart for my supper." "Art thou sure of that, your majesty?" asked the trout with a twinkle in his eye. "Methinks it is but a year since she married the gallant young prince who came from abroad to seek her hand and returned with him to his own country." When the queen heard these words, she turned quite cold with rage, for she knew that her husband had deceived her, and she rose from her knees and went straight home to the palace, and, hiding her anger as best she could, she asked him if he would give orders to have the long-ship made ready, as she wished to go and visit her dear stepdaughter, for it was such a very long time since she had seen her. The king was somewhat surprised at her request, but he was only too glad to think that she had got over her hatred towards his daughter, and he gave orders that the long ship should be made ready at once. Soon it was speeding over the water, its prow turned in the direction of the land where the princess lived, steered by the queen herself, for she knew the course that the boat ought to take, and she was in such haste to be at her journey's end that she would allow no one else to take the helm. Now it chanced that Princess Goldtree was alone that day, for her husband had gone a-hunting, and as she looked out of one of the castle windows, she saw a boat coming sailing over the sea towards the landing place. She recognized it as her father's long-ship, and she guessed only too well whom it carried on board. She was almost beside herself with terror at the thought, for she knew that it was for no good purpose that Queen Silvertree had taken the trouble to set out to visit her, and she felt that she would have given almost anything she possessed if her husband had but been at home. In her distress she hurried into the servants' hall. "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" she cried. "For I see my father's long-ship coming over the sea, and I know that my stepmother is on board. And if she have a chance, she will kill me, for she hateth me more than anything else upon earth." Now the servants worshipped the ground that their young mistress trod on, for she was always kind and considerate to them, and when they saw how frightened she was and heard her piteous words, they crowded round her as if to shield her from any harm that threatened her. "Do not be afraid, your highness," they cried. "We will defend thee with our very lives if need be. But in case thy lady stepmother should have the power to throw any evil spell over thee, we will lock thee in the great mullion chamber. Then she cannot get nigh thee at all." Now the mullion chamber was a strong room, which was in a part of the castle all by itself, and its door was so thick that no one could possibly break through it, and the princess knew that if she were once inside the room, with its stout oaken door between her and her stepmother, she would be perfectly safe from any mischief that the wicked woman could devise. So she consented to her faithful servant's suggestion, and allowed them to lock her in the mullion chamber. So it came to pass that when Queen Silvertree arrived at the great door of the castle, and commanded the lackey who opened it to take her to his royal mistress, he told her with a low bow that that was impossible, because the princess was locked in the strong room of the castle, and could not get out, because no one knew where the key was. Which was quite true, for the old butler had tied it round the neck of the prince's favourite sheepdog, and had sent him away to the hills to seek his master. "Take me to the door of the apartment," commanded the queen. "At least I can speak to my dear daughter through it." And the lackey, who did not see what harm could possibly come from this, did as he was bid. "If the key is really lost, and thou canst not come out to welcome me, dear Goldtree," said the deceitful queen, "at least put thy little finger through the keyhole that I may kiss it." The princess did so, never dreaming that evil could come to her through such a simple action, but it did. For instead of kissing the tiny finger, her stepmother stabbed it with a poisoned needle, and so deadly was the poison that before she could utter a single cry, the poor princess fell as one dead on the floor. When she heard the fall, a smile of satisfaction crept over Queen Silvertree's face. "Now I can say that I am the handsomest woman in the world," she whispered, and she went back to the lackey who stood waiting at the end of the passage, and told him that she had said all that she had to say to her daughter, and that now she must return home. So the man attended her to the boat with all due ceremony, and she set sail for her own country, and no one in the castle knew that any harm had befallen their dear mistress until the prince came home from his hunting with the key of the mullion chamber, which he had taken from his sheepdog's neck, in his hand. He laughed when he heard the story of Queen Silvertree's visit, and told the servants that they had done well. Then he ran upstairs to open the door and release his wife. But what was his horror and dismay when he did so, to find her lying dead at his feet on the floor. He was nearly beside himself with rage and grief, and because he knew that a deadly poison such as Queen Silvertree had used would preserve the princess's body, so that it had no need of burial. He had it laid on a silken couch and left in the mullion chamber, so that he could go and look at it whenever he pleased. He was so terribly lonely, however, that in a little time he married again, and his second wife was just as sweet and as good as the first one had been. This new wife was very happy. There was only one little thing that caused her any trouble at all, and she was too sensible to let it make her miserable. That one thing was that there was one room in the castle, a room which stood at the end of a passage by itself, which she could never enter, as her husband always carried the key. And as, when she asked him the reason of this, he always made an excuse of some kind, she made up her mind that she would not seem as if she did not trust him, so she asked no more questions about the matter. But one day the prince chanced to leave the door unlocked, and as he had never told her not to do so, she went in, and there she saw Princess Goldtree lying on the silken couch, looking as if she were asleep. "Is she dead, or is she only sleeping?" she said to herself, and she went up to the couch and looked closely at the princess, and there, sticking in her little finger, she discovered a curiously shaped needle. "There have been evil work here," she thought to herself. "If that needle be not poisoned, then I know naught of medicine." And being skilled in leechcraft, she drew it carefully out. In a moment Princess Goldtree opened her eyes and sat up, and presently she had recovered sufficiently to tell the other princess the whole story. Now, if her stepmother had been jealous, the other princess was not jealous at all, for when she heard all that had happened, she clapped her little hands, crying, "Oh, how glad the prince will be, for although he have married again, I know that he loves thee best." That night the prince came home from hunting looking very tired and sad, for what his second wife had said was quite true. Although he loved her very much, he was always mourning in his heart for his first dear love, Princess Goldtree. "How sad thou art!" exclaimed his wife, going out to meet him. "Is there nothing that I can do to bring a smile to thy face?" "Nothing," answered the prince wearily, laying down his bow, for he was too heart-sore even to pretend to be gay. "Except to give thee back Goldtree," said his wife mischievously, "and that can I do. Thou wilt find her alive and well in the mullion chamber." Without a word the prince ran upstairs, and sure enough, there was his dear Goldtree sitting on the couch, ready to welcome him. He was so overjoyed to see her that he threw his arms round her neck and kissed her over and over again, quite forgetting his poor second wife, who had followed him upstairs, and who now stood watching the meeting that she had brought about. She did not seem to be sorry for herself, however. "I always knew that thy heart yearned after Princess Goldtree," she said, "and it is but right that it should be so, for she was thy first love, and since she have come to life again, I will go back to mine own people." "No, indeed thou wilt not," answered the prince, "for it is thou who hast brought me this joy. thou wilt stay with us, and we shall all three live happily together, and Gold Tree and thee will become great friends." And so it came to pass, for Princess Gold Tree and the other princess soon became like sisters, and loved each other as if they had been brought up together all their lives. In this manner another year passed away, and one evening in the old country Queen Silver Tree went, as she had done before, to look at her face in the water of the little well in the glen. And, as had happened twice before, the trout was there. "Trouty, Trouty," she whispered, "am not I the most beautiful woman in the world?" "By my troth, thou art not," answered the trout, as he had answered on the 2 previous occasions. "And who dost thou say is the most beautiful woman now?" asked the queen, her voice trembling with rage and vexation. I have given her name to thee these 2 years back," answered the trout. "The Princess Gold Tree, of course." "But she is dead. I am sure of it this time, for it is just a year since I stabbed her little finger with a poisoned needle, and I heard her fall down dead on the floor." "I would not be so sure of that," answered the trout, and without saying another word he dived straight down to the bottom of the well. After hearing his mysterious words, the queen could not rest, and at last she asked her husband to have the long ship prepared once more, so that she could go and see her stepdaughter. The king gave the order gladly, and it all happened as it had happened before. She steered the ship over the sea with her own hands, and when it was approaching the land, it was seen and recognized by Princess Gold Tree. The prince was out hunting, and the princess ran in great terror to her friend, the other princess, who was upstairs in her chamber. "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" she cried. "For I see my father's longship coming, and I know that my cruel stepmother is on board, and she will try to kill me, as she tried to kill me before. Oh, come, let us escape to the hills." "Not at all," replied the other princess, throwing her arms round the trembling Gold Tree. "I am not afraid of thy lady stepmother. Come with me, and we will go down to the seashore to greet her." So they both went down to the edge of the water, and when Queen Silvertree saw her stepdaughter coming, she pretended to be very glad, and sprang out of the boat and ran to meet her, and held out a silver goblet full of wine for her to drink. "'Tis rare wine from the East," she said, "and therefore very precious. I brought a flagon with me, so that we might pledge each other in a loving cup." Princess Gold Tree, who was ever gentle and courteous, would have stretched out her hand for the cup, had not the other princess stepped between her and her stepmother. "Nay, madam," she said gravely, looking the queen straight in the face, "it is the custom in this land for the one who offers a loving cup to drink from it first herself." "I will follow the custom gladly," answered the queen, and she raised the goblet to her mouth. But the other princess, who was watching for closely, noticed that she did not allow the wine that it contained to touch her lips. So she stepped forward and, as if by accident, struck the bottom of the goblet with her shoulder. Part of its contents flew into the queen's face, and part, before she could shut her mouth, went down her throat. So, because of her wickedness, she was, as the good book says, caught in her own net, for she had made the wine so poisonous that, almost before she had swallowed it, she fell dead at the 2 princesses' feet. No one was sorry for her, for she really deserved her fate, and they buried her hastily in a lonely piece of ground, and very soon everybody had forgotten all about her. As for Princess Gold Tree, she lived happily and peacefully with her husband and her friend for the remainder of her life. Whippety Story. I'm going to tell you a story about a poor young widow woman who lived in a house called Kittle Rumpet, though whereabouts in Scotland the house of Kittle Rumpet stood, nobody knows. Some folk think that it stood in the neighbourhood of the debatable land, which, as all the world knows, where the old border ravers were constantly coming and going, the Scotch stealing from the English and the English from the Scotch. Be that as it may, the widowed mistress of Kittle Rumpet was sorely to be pitied, for she had lost her husband, and no one quite knew what had become of him. He had gone to a fair one day and had never come back again, and although everybody believed that he was dead, no one knew how he died. Some people said that he had been persuaded to enlist and had been killed in the wars. Others, that he had been taken away to serve as a sailor by the press gang and had been drowned at sea. At any rate, his poor young wife was sorely to be pitied, for she was left with a little baby boy to bring up. And as times were bad, she had not much to live on. But she loved her baby dearly and worked all day amongst her cows and pigs and hens in order to earn enough money to buy food and clothes for both herself and him. Now, on the morning of which I'm speaking, she rose very early and went out to feed her pigs. For rent day was coming on, and she intended to take one of them, a great big fat creature, to the market that very day, as she thought that the price that it would fetch would go a long way towards paying her rent. And because she thought so, her heart was light, and she hummed a little song to herself as she crossed the yard with her bucket on one arm and her baby boy on the other. But the song was quickly changed into a cry of despair when she reached the pigsty, for there lay her cherished pig on its back with its legs in the air and its eyes shut, just as if it were going to breathe its last breath. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" cried the poor woman, sitting down on a big stone and clasping her boy to her breast, heedless of the fact that she had dropped her bucket. "First I lost my husband, and now I'm going to lose my finest pig, the pig that I hoped would fetch a deal of money." Now, I must explain to you that the house of Kittle Rumpet stood on a hillside with a great fir wood behind it, and the ground sloping down steeply in front. And as the poor young thing, after having a good cry to herself, was drying her eyes, she chanced to look down the hill, and who should she see coming up it but an old woman who looked like a lady born. She was dressed all in green, with a white apron, and she wore a black velvet hood on her head, and a steeple-crowned beaver hat over that, something like those, as I have heard tell, that the women wear in Wales. She walked very slowly, leaning on a long staff, and she gave a bit hurple now and then, as if she were lame. As she drew near, the young widow felt it was becoming to rise and curtsy to the gentlewoman, for such she saw her to be. "Madam," she said, with a sob in her voice, "I bid you welcome to the house of Kittle Rumpet, although you find its mistress one of the most unfortunate women in the world." "Hout tout," answered the old lady in such a harsh voice that the young woman started and grasped her baby tighter in her arms. "Ye have little need to say that. Ye have lost your husband, I grant ye, but there were worse losses at Shirramere. And now your pig is like to die. I could maybe remedy that, but I must first hear how much ye would give me if I cured him." "Anything that your ladyship's madam likes to ask," replied the widow, too much delighted at having the animal's life saved to think that she was making rather a rash promise. "Very good," said the old dame, and without wasting any more words, she walked straight into the pigsty. She stood and looked at the dying creature for some minutes, rocking to and fro, muttering to herself in words which the widow could not understand. At least she could only understand 4 of them, and they sounded something like this: "Peter Pater, holy water." Then she put her hand into her pocket and drew out a tiny bottle with a liquid that looked like oil in it. She took the cork out and dropped one of her long, ladylike fingers into it. Then she touched the pig on the snout and on his ears and on the tip of his curly tail. No sooner had she done so than up the beast jumped, and with a grunt of contentment ran off to its trough to look for its breakfast. A joyful woman was the mistress of Kittle Rumpet when she saw it do this, for she felt that her rent was safe, and in her relief and gratitude she would have kissed the hem of the strange lady's green gown if she would have allowed it, but she would not. "No, no," said she, and her voice sounded harsher than ever. "Let us have no fine meanderings, but let us stick to our bargain. I have done my part in mending the pig. Now ye must do yours, and give me what I like to ask. Your son." And the poor widow gave a piteous cry, for she knew now what she had not guessed before, that the green-clad lady was a fairy, and a wicked fairy too. Else had she not asked such a terrible thing? It was too late now, however, to pray and beseech and beg for mercy. The fairy stood her ground, hard and cruel. "Ye promised me what I liked to ask, and I have asked your son, and your son I will have," she replied. "So it is useless making such a din about it. But one thing I may tell you, for I know well that the knowledge will not help you. By the laws of fairyland, I cannot take the bairn till the third day after this, and if by that time you have found out my name, I cannot take him even then. But ye will not be able to find it out. Of that I am certain. So I will call back for the boy in 3 days." And with that she disappeared round the back of the pigsty, and the poor mother fell down in a dead faint beside the stone. All that day and all the next she did nothing but sit in her kitchen and cry, and hug her baby tighter in her arms. But on the day before that, on which the fairy said that she was coming back, she felt as if she must get a little breath of fresh air. So she went for a walk in the fir wood behind the house. Now in this fir wood there was an old quarry hole, in the bottom of which was a bonny spring well, the water of which was always sweet and pure. The young widow was walking near this quarry hole, when to her astonishment she heard the whir of a spinning wheel and the sound of a voice lilting a song. At first she could not think where the sound came from. Then, remembering the quarry, she lay down her child at a tree root and crept noiselessly through the bushes on her hands and knees to the edge of the hole and peeped over. She could hardly believe her eyes, for there, far below her, at the bottom of the quarry, beside the spring well, sat the cruel fairy, dressed in her green frock and tall felt hat, spinning away as fast as she could at a tiny spinning wheel. And what should she be singing but "Little kens our guide dame at home, Whippety Story is my name." The widow woman almost cried aloud for joy, for now she had learned the fairy's secret, and her child was safe. But she dare not, in case the wicked old dame heard her and threw some other spell over her. So she crept softly back to the place where she had left her child. Then, catching him up in her arms, she ran through the wood to her house, laughing and singing and tossing him in the air in such a state of delight that if anyone had met her, they would have been in danger of thinking that she was mad. Now, this young woman had been a merry-hearted maiden, and would have been merry-hearted still if, since her marriage, she had not had so much trouble that it had made her grow old and sober-minded before her time. And she began to think what fun it would be to tease the fairy for a few minutes before she let her know that she had found out her name. So the next day, at the appointed time, she went out with her boy in her arms and seated herself on the big stone where she had sat before. And when she saw the old dame coming up the hill, She crumpled up her nice clean cap and screwed up her face and pretended to be in great distress and to be crying bitterly. The fairy took no notice of this, however, but came close up to her and said, in her harsh, merciless voice, "Good wife of Kittle Rumpet, ye ken the reason of my coming. Give me the bairn." Then the young mother pretended to be in sorer distress than ever, and fell on her knees before the wicked old woman and begged for mercy. "Oh, sweet madam mistress," she cried, "spare me my bairn, and take an thou wilt the pig instead." "We have no need of bacon where I come from," answered the fairy coldly. "So give me the laddie, and let me be gone. I have no time to waste in this wise." "Oh, dear lady mine," pleaded the good wife, "if thou wilt not have the pig, wilt thou not spare my poor bairn, and take me myself?" The fairy stepped back a little, as if in astonishment. "Art thou mad, woman?" she cried contemptuously. "That thou proposest such a thing? Who in all the world would care to take a plain-looking, red-eyed, dowdy wife like thee with them?" Now the young mistress of Kittle Rumpet knew that she was no beauty, and the knowledge had never vexed her. But something in the fairy's tone made her feel so angry that she could contain herself no longer. "In troth, fair madam, I might have had the wit to know that the likes of me is not fit to tie the shoestring of the high and mighty Princess Whippety Stowry. If there had been a charge of gunpowder buried in the ground, and if it had suddenly exploded beneath her feet, the wicked fairy could not have jumped higher into the air. And when she came down again, she simply turned round and ran down the brae, shrieking with rage and disappointment for all the world, as an old book says, like an owl chased by witches. And when she came down again, she simply turned round and ran down the brae, shrieking with rage and disappointment, for all the world, as an old book says, like an owl chased by witches.